Well, welcome to a special CBF podcast conversation live on Facebook and YouTube. Each week, we are bringing you stories from across the world of people doing groundbreaking and innovative work in renewing God's world. Ideas, stories, and creativity from practitioners, ministers, thinkers, authors, and more. I'm Andy Hale, CBF's podcast host, and this week, we have a special conversation with the author of I Was Hungry. This is part of CBF's book club. You can check out more details about the books featured, including discussion guides for small group study and other resources at cbf.net/books. Our October selection is Brown Church by Robert Chow Romero, and discussion guides will be available on the website next month. And you can also check out my conversation with the CBF podcast that I had with him last December. In a few moments, I'll introduce our guests and we'll jump into the conversation, but we need to pause to tell you about one of our annual sponsors, the Baptist Seminary of Kentucky. The Institute for Black Church Studies at BSK launched in August. The launch of the Institute brings leaders with Louisville, Kentucky's Festival of Faiths, an interfaith event that seeks to bring attention to certain issues or topics. This event will be held in Louisville, November 18th through the 20th. This year's theme is Sacred Change, Central Conversations on Faith and Race. Dr. Lewis Brogdon, the executive director of the Institute of Black Church Studies at BSK, is leading this event, and BSK will be among the featured organizations. Specifically, BSK will host a session titled Black Faith Encounters with Black Trauma, Pain, and Nihilism. Learn more on how you can participate at institute.bsk.edu. Well, our guest for this week's CBF podcast conversation is Jeremy Everett. Jeremy is the founder and executive director of the Baylor Collaborative on Hunger and Poverty. Jeremy, thank you for joining the conversation.
Well, thank you for having me, Andy. It's great to be here and great to be with all of our friends around CBF congregations around the U.S. And I know we've got a lot of great people doing work on CBF's behalf around the world. So always a pleasure to be with you.
Well, before we went live, you and I were talking. Last time we saw each other, we were in Washington, D.C. when the world realized this was a serious pandemic. And I was in D.C. last week, and here we are having another conversation, and yet we are still in this pandemic, but it's always good to be with you. For those that are watching this live, you can submit your questions for later on in the interview with commenting to the right on Facebook or below on YouTube. Jeremy, tell us about the Baylor Collaborative on Hunger and Poverty. What kind of work do y'all do? I know it's in the title, but tell us more about what you do.
Yeah, well, our job is to cultivate scalable solutions to end hunger. And so we do that really through three particular areas: research, public policy, and practice. And so the way that we work is all of our work that we are implementing on the ground is informed by research that our research team is involved with. We have about 55 research fellows from all different academic disciplines looking at various aspects of hunger and poverty, both in the U.S. and around the world, to help us identify what could be the best solutions to address the problem. Now, one of the things we talk about with our researchers all the time is if they misidentify the problem, then our solutions are always going to be wrong. So we really focus and have a high priority on research. And then we translate that to practice. You know, Brian Stevenson says you can't solve a social problem from a distance. You have to have proximity to the problem. Former Congressman John Lewis talked about incarnational organizing when he was with the Students for Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, during the Civil Rights Movement. And so we try to practice that. So we have field offices around Texas and partner organizations around the country and around the world who have proximity to people that are experiencing food insecurity and organizations that are addressing it. And we find that if we have proximity and research paired together, that we typically do a better job of creating scalable solutions than if we tried to do either one independently of each other. And that's how we translated all the policy. And it's through policy that we're able to get those scalable solutions. I'll tell you one funny story. So when you and I were in DC together, that was my last trip to DC, for about a year and a half. And of course, I had no idea that would be the case. As we left our little session together, I was called back to United States Department of Ag, where the secretary and the acting undersecretary asked if we would be willing to take our small little Meals to You program, which is a program where we We're serving about 4,000 children in East and West Texas during the summer in rural communities. Well, they didn't have access to summer meal sites. And so we were mailing boxes of food directly to their front porches. And the program worked great. In the summer of 2019, we served about 500,000 meals and snacks to kids in those 20 different school districts. The plan was to scale it. So we were planning to scale it to New Mexico and Alaska. But when I got that phone call from USDA asking me to come back, at the behest of Congress, they asked us if we'd be willing to scale that program nationwide. And within a few days, we were up and running in partnerships with McLean Global and Chartwell's and PepsiCo's Food for Good team, and ended up serving children, about 300,000 children, 2 meals a day while schools were shut down, and about 40 million meals in total in some really remote areas. One of those areas was in Alaska. We literally had dog sled teams taking food boxes to kids, and some of the front porches in Alaska that we were dropping boxes off via helicopters and seaplanes could see Russia from their front porches, and then we had UPS drivers dropping boxes off everywhere else in between. And I never would have imagined when you and I were talking that afternoon that would be in store for us within a week. And man, the world has certainly been turned upside down over the past year and a half. But always glad to be with you, and grateful for the work that you do to help form and shape our parishioners all over CBF, the CBF world.
So what I hear you saying is anytime somebody comes on the CBF podcast, good things happen immediately afterwards.
That you're the pastor, so if that's how you want to exegete this, then I'll defer.
All right. So prior to launching the collaborative in 2009, you founded and served as the executive director of the Texas Hunger Initiative, this capacity building anti-hunger project within Baylor University. You've also written extensively on hunger issues in America, including 3 books: Food and Poverty, The End of Hunger, and the book featured in CBF's book club, I Was Hungry. So where did this passion for those facing food insecurity begin?
Well, I would say, for me, I grew up, my father is a Baptist pastor, and so is my grandfather. And so we used to joke that my dad only had 3 years worth of sermons. And that certainly wasn't true, but we moved a lot when I was growing up as a kid. And I had an opportunity. It was a real opportunity for me to be able to see all walks of life. We would oftentimes go to churches where you might have the congressman or the business community well represented at those churches. And then I would play basketball in public schools where I might be on playing basketball with other guys who lived in housing projects. And so it wasn't uncommon for me to be able to spend time on the basketball court in one of the housing projects all afternoon, and then go over to another friend's house at a country club. And that inequity was probably really simmering in my subconscious level until I got to college. And it was in college when I came across the story of St. Francis of Assisi, where I realized that I felt called to the issue of hunger and poverty. And ultimately, after watching the movie Brother, Sun, Sister, Moon, which catalogs St. Francis's story, I knew I needed to follow suit. So I gathered up all my possessions. I drove over the mountain in Birmingham, where I was in college, to Kelly Ingram Park, where a lot of the civil rights activity happened. And at the time, a lot of homeless people hung out there, and I gave away my stuff. And at that point, I knew I was called to the issue of poverty. I had no idea what that meant. I didn't know anything about nonprofit work. I'd certainly never heard of social work. And so it has certainly been a journey to get to the point where I am now. But for me, this work is 100% a calling. And a part of that calling, a part of call and response is many of us know Susie Painter. And if she calls, you respond. And so in 2008, she called to say that she was interested in developing a statewide, if not national, project to address hunger, and asked if I was willing to be a part of it, which ultimately it became the Texas Hunger Initiative. And so whenever she calls, and you always want to say yes, and I certainly did. And so I jumped at the opportunity to be able to work with her and Baylor School of Social Work at that time to launch the Texas Hunger Initiative. But what happened is within a few years, we were already operating in states all over the country. And so we knew we needed to create a larger umbrella. So we ultimately created the Baylor Collaborative on Hunger and Poverty, of which THI is a part of. And so that's been a wonderful journey to be able to be a part of.
I can look at myself in this video prompt and I can see just how much I enjoy food. And when I take a step back, so many of my memories center around food, whether, holiday meals with family that are no longer with us, the reception at my wedding. I think of the humble meals prepared for mission immersion teams that I've taken to the mountains of Ecuador by the locals there. And yet, I consider just how many people lack food, let alone the ability to gather with others around a meal. With these kinds of connections in mind, when we think of meal, paint an image for us of the reality of food insecurity in our communities and in America.
Yeah, I write, in I Was Hungry, I share a lot of stories. So as you well know, Andy, a part of my formative experience after that calling was living in low-income communities for 20 years so that I could experience hunger and poverty from the inside out. And that was very, very formational for me and our family, and grateful for those 2 decades of experience being able to do that. But when we think about hunger and poverty in the U.S., what we oftentimes think about is, we think about the myths that exist of the welfare queen or people being lazy. But the primary cause of hunger in the U.S. is underemployment, meaning that people are working, but they don't make enough money to be able to make ends meet. So if you're living in Louisiana or Texas or other states that still have the $7.25 minimum wage or the federal minimum wage, if you're able to get 40 hours of work a week, which you typically don't, 52 weeks out of the year, you still bring home less than $15,000 a year. And so even in places with a low cost of living, you can barely afford rent, much less pay a car payment, which places in mid-sized cities and rural communities around the country, you don't have public transit systems. And so you can barely afford to pay a car payment. You can barely afford to pay your light bill or healthcare costs or pay for food. And so what families are forced to do is they're forced to make trade-offs each month. And they have to decide, what are they going to pay for? Are they going to pay for rent? If they don't, they get kicked out of their home. Are they going to pay for their light bill? If they don't, their power's shut off, or their car could get repossessed if they don't pay their car payment. So they typically make food the trade-off. So they stretch their food budget towards the end of a pay period every month to be able to make ends meet. And what makes matters more difficult is a term that we really never talk about in the church, but it should be a part of our common vernacular if we're serious about engaging food and economic justice. And the term is income volatility. It's a wonky term, but essentially what it means is it's a fluctuation in wages. And so people think, well, people in low-income households just need to do a better job of budgeting. Well, any of us, Andy, I'm sure you have, and I certainly have worked a lot of minimum wage paying jobs in my life. And you don't really get to set your schedule, right? Your supervisor sets your schedule. And so some weeks you might get 15 hours. The next week you might get 10. The following week you might get 20 hours. But you don't get to choose how many hours you get on a weekly basis. Furthermore, if you have 2 or 3 jobs, which is what typically low-income Americans are doing, is they're piecing together as many jobs as they can find, your site supervisors are not calling each other to coordinate your schedule for the week. And so inevitably, your jobs are going to compete with each other. You're going to have to choose one over the other, which means that you're going to lose a job. And so it creates income volatility. I mean, you can't possibly predict how much money you're going to make on a weekly basis. And when that's the case, it just means skyrocketing food insecurity. So it's a wonky term, but it's something that we need to know if we're going to better understand how to address the plight of food insecurity in America.
Jeremy, I'll say this tongue in cheek, but this is America. This is the land of the free. Don't we have systems to help combat hunger and food insecurity? Or maybe we should be asking what's wrong with the systems we have and what should be done about them.
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a big question. And we do, one of the great things that we're talking about right now is we're talking about access to an adequate amount of food. So the term food insecurity is the technical term that we often use when we're measuring hunger. And it basically means, does someone have enough food to live an active, healthy lifestyle? Now, we could kind of boil that down or distill it down to 2 healthy meals a day, or 3 healthy meals a day. But not all of us need 3 healthy meals a day to be able to live an active, healthy lifestyle. I probably at this stage in my life need less food than what I'm currently taking in. But so what has to happen? So the great thing is that production is not the issue anymore. So typically, when we think about 1980s and hunger, we think about famine in Ethiopia, right? That's the image that comes to our mind, the stilled bellies in Africa. But famine is really no longer the primary cause of hunger worldwide. And so we've really evolved significantly as a world in terms of food production. So we are producing an adequate amount of food. Now, that doesn't mean that the food system doesn't need to be improved, but that does mean that we're producing an adequate amount of food. The problem is in access. And one of those problems is because, like some of our faith brothers and sisters in different denominations in the Christian household have this idea of a right to food, this concept of a right to food. So we think about the right to vote in the U.S., but we don't think about the right to food. But if we had a right to food, if we operated from that mindset, it fundamentally changes everything. It changes how we set up the food system. It changes where we put grocery stores. It changes what kind of food we want to ensure access to, so that people are not having diet-related disease because they only have access to unhealthy food, or they don't have adequate access to food, which also has ramifications on your ability to for your brain to fully develop when you're a child, or to be able to concentrate, to be able to learn, to be able to live an active, healthy lifestyle. So all that to say, we do produce enough food. The church can really lean into the fact that the major gap that we have on the local level is we don't have collaborative partnerships between nonprofit organizations and faith communities and government agencies and the corporate sector. And so oftentimes what we've tried to do in church life is we say that this is a church issue and not a government issue. Or sometimes maybe you'll hear the East Coast progressives say, this is a government issue and not a church issue. But the reality is that the issue is too big for any one sector to address by themselves. And it inherently requires us all to work together. So churches can really lead that collaborative model or that collaborative effort on a local level. And that's one way that we can see transformative change. But it's not an issue of production. And so that's a good step forward.
We could probably do a whole session just on COVID and food insecurity. But I wonder in your study and the research that y'all are finding, the work that people are doing, how COVID pandemic escalated the need for real change and action around food insecurity?
Well, it in a number of ways. First of all, America did a really good job of stepping up to address hunger during the pandemic. Particularly now, we know in places like Texas, Louisiana, and many states, the Delta surge has been as extreme as the first surge with COVID. But businesses are open again, schools are open again, and so the economy has recovered to a point. Last year, when businesses were closing, so we talked about income volatility. Well, now imagine, that hit frontline workers the most. Now I was able to go work from home, so I didn't have to deal with income volatility when the pandemic happened. And many of our ministers were able to go work from home. It meant you had to figure out how to offer church online, so it was a very difficult year. But you're able to keep your job. Well, families who are frontline workers, they weren't able to keep their jobs, and so 1 week or 1 month, their businesses may be closed completely. The next month, they might be partially open, and then the surge might happen again, and so forth. So one of the things that we did as America is we threw everything in the kitchen sink at hunger. Federal government relaxed regulations. So, for example, previously, kids would have to attend a congregate meal location, whether that was in school or even during the summer months, to be able to access a meal. Well, they didn't require that anymore. So we could mail boxes directly to people's front porches. You could do curbside meal programs. We expanded the amount of resources available for people that are eligible for the SNAP program, creating unemployment benefits and child tax credits. All those things had a real positive impact on our intervention to address food insecurity in America. So we saw the rates of food insecurity in 2019 and 2020 looking relatively similar. And that's because we did so much work to intervene to address the issue that we were able to avoid catastrophe. What we found, though, and what I think a lot of us experienced, was the reality of when you went into the grocery store and there wasn't food on the shelf. And all of a sudden, those of us in middle class households and upper class households had to deal with the reality that we may not be able to put food on the table, on our own tables. And I think that shocked us into the reality that families are facing on a regular basis around our country. So I hope that we lean into that, and that moves us towards compassion. Now, I will say on a global level that it didn't fare so well. We went from 135 million people on the brink of starvation to now 270 million people on the brink of starvation. And so, man-made conflict and climate change and migration were already rampant around the world. And so you threw in a pandemic, and things have gotten really, really difficult. So anyway, those are a couple of notes that have happened since the pandemic.
I really feel like we shouldn't have to take time to talk about the gospel implications towards caring for the poor and the marginalized and the hungry. The last time we were together, I quoted some statistics from scripture in which the Bible talks about poverty and justice over 2,000 times. And just to give a little comparison, the Bible talks about believing 273 times, praying 371 times, love 714 times, but poverty and justice over 2,000 times. Yet in a given Sunday in America, I'm going to go on a limb and say that most people are not talking about their Sunday school and worship, talking about the rights of the impoverished and seeking justice. So why do you think that we have this continued disconnect from the Bible's overwhelming concern on such matters to the potential religious perspectives of, a predominant group, the American evangelical?
Well, that's a big question, and it's an important question, and I think it's probably one of the most pressing questions that we need to be asking ourselves and our congregations right now. So I appreciate you asking that. First of all, I would say let's go to the gospel. So I named the book "I Was Hungry" after the Matthew 25 text when Jesus has returned. This is the only eschatological scene in the entire Gospel of Matthew. And Jesus has returned as the king, and he begins to gather all the people before him, and he begins to separate the sheep and the goats, the righteous from the accused. And to the astonishment of me, and to the astonishment of the people gathered, the criterion for judgment wasn't confession of faith in Christ. Nothing was said of grace, justification, or the forgiveness of sins. What mattered is whether or not a person had acted with love and cared for the needy. These acts weren't just extra credit, but they constituted the decisive criterion for judgment. So essentially, when we responded or failed to respond to people who were hungry or people who were in need or the migrant, we were in fact responding or failing to respond to Christ. So the calling of the faithful is clear: feed the hungry and you'll live. So that is very clear in that Matthew 25 text. I think part of what has happened, we have bifurcated. Those of us who are largely a part of CBF, who find ourselves in predominantly white congregations. Certainly, as Baptists, we have roots that go back many, hundreds of years in the U.S. During the time of slavery, we bifurcated the gospel because a part, of the revivalist movement was we wanted to save souls, and so a conscious effort was made to save the souls of slaves. But in order to ensure that they were not given any kind of rights that might be extended to them by being a part of the Christian household, we stripped out, we literally created the slave Bible, and we stripped out all of the references towards any kind of what we now call the social gospel, or any kind of references that might say the slave and the free, are all one in Christ. We stripped all of that out. And then we carried this myth on for the last several hundred years that the good news is about belief and faith, and that doing, what the social gospel is called isn't really about the gospel at all. And many people even called it just a progressive agenda. But the reality is, the social gospel and the good news of Jesus coming and dwelling among us, dying for our sins, and welcome us into heaven, is all inextricably intertwined with that of the social gospel. And we see it very clearly in Matthew 25 when Jesus refers to the people who are hungry and thirsty, the migrant, the person in prison. He identifies as with those people as members of his own family, and the rest of us are judged based upon what we did or don't do to further their cause. So for us, I feel like in the church, the primary thing we need to be doing right now, even more than opening up a food pantry or even engaging in community related work, which certainly needs to be a byproduct of this, is faith formation. We have to reform who we are as followers of Jesus, so that you think about an athlete. They don't, it's football season, right? And so our athletes that are performing well on the football field on Saturdays and Sundays are hard at work, Monday through Friday. They are practicing, they are lifting weights, they are doing everything to keep their minds and bodies as right as possible so that they can perform well on the field. And on the field, if you think about the field for us as Christians, that's when we're engaging communities that are in poverty, communities that have been hit hard by the migrant crisis, communities that are starving all over the world, even here in our backyards. And so we need to be formed fully so that when we engage them, we can engage them in the way that Jesus intended for us to do so. So anyway, obviously I can get preachy when it comes to that, but that to me is, I think that question that you presented is the principal question that we need to be dealing with in our 21st century reality.
And I'll show just a general maturity and a little bit of tact to not bring up Baylor football this year, as you brought up a Sports Illustration. But that's another conversation for another time. Hey, you guys won the national championship in basketball. Demonizing, vilifying, objectifying the poor. Used a term earlier, welfare queens or welfare kings, or saying people are working the system is a way to detach ourselves from very real people facing very real problems. As followers of Jesus, we can so easily vilify others, even if the others are those that we consider to be theologically bigoted fundamentalists. I know this might be silly, but how do we do spiritual formation around developing authentic sense of compassion and empathy for those facing food insecurity, let alone the actions to actually do something about it?
Your questions are spot on. And first, so a friend of mine, John Garland, is John Garland is the pastor of San Antonio Mennonite. Many people in the CBF world know John or know his family. His dad served as interim president several times and dean of Truett Seminary. And his mother, Diana Garland, is the namesake of the School of Social Work at Baylor, which is where our project was initially founded. Well, John, oftentimes when people are talking about policies around the issue of migration, he says, that policies are important questions to deal with, but they're not always a Christian question. And so one of the things that we hear very frequently from people who are working in food pantries or people that are engaging some of that frontline work around America is, does that person deserve our support? Are they a part of the deserving poor? And essentially what they mean is, are they working and should we come alongside and help them, or are they just trying to live off the system? And what I would say is that that's not a Christian question. That may be an important question to ask, but that is not a Christian question. The Christian question is, how can I help you? The Christian question is, how can I walk alongside you to be able to help you get on your feet, or what other needs can we come alongside you to address? And so I think that's an important distinction. So if people are coming to the church for help or assistance, we help them. And now, when we think about the bigger issues of hunger and poverty, I just also want to remind us of what I said earlier, that people who are experiencing hunger and poverty are predominantly employed, and that they're underemployed, and that we have a myriad of reasons why people experience food insecurity. One would be structural racism. This year, while we did see USDA numbers, food insecurity numbers, not decline as dramatically as we thought we might, one of the things that we saw is that if you were a person of color, you were 3 times as likely to experience food insecurity as a person in an Anglo household during the pandemic. And so we still saw equity really beginning to continue, or inequity continuing to grow during the pandemic instead of moving in the right direction. So I think it's important for us as people of faith then is that we have to gain proximity. And so there are a couple of ways to gain proximity. Meals on Wheels programs are around the country. And that's a great way to partner with an agency that needs volunteers and to be able to have access to individuals who are experiencing both being shut in. Most of them are elderly, and being able to build a relationship with them and to be able to hear about their lives and what they're experiencing today and who they have been throughout their lives, learn about their families. That will give you a glimmer of what is happening in communities as you're trying to address poverty. It also gives you an outlet to be able to serve them in that same capacity. But proximity is key. And if you don't have proximity, then again, your solutions are likely going to be wrong, and your interpretation of poverty and hunger is probably going to be wrong as well.
One of the greatest theological disconnects is between the gospel and our political persuasion. I took a deep breath and let it out, just because, knowing about bringing this up becomes contentious immediately for some people. Quote, good Christian people endorse partisan dismantling of programs that give aid to those facing hunger by the way that they vote. And for most evangelicals in America, there is a solitary issue that drives their voting habit. And I'm not here to debate the validity of the pro-life causation of voting. But it would seem as though more people are facing suffering and poverty and hunger and death in America than the threat of pro-choice policies. So why do you think there's such a large concentration of evangelicals in America putting their support behind? Why do you think there's a lack of a larger concentration of evangelicals putting their support behind ending food insecurity versus voting so partisan really around one issue?
Well, thanks for that question, Andy. And knowing that this is being recorded, so I guess I'll just go ahead and never run for public office.
Sorry, Jeff.
That's great. No, that's a great question, and I'll share with you my perspective, but in no stretch, it should only be taken as that. First of all, as an organization, the Baylor Collaborative, we are what I call politically pragmatic. So everybody that works for us, is probably engaged in public policy or politics on the local level or on the state or national level in their own personal time. But as an organization, we are politically pragmatic. And it's because we don't believe that either one party can end hunger by themselves. If I think that the Democrats can end hunger and poverty by themselves, or the Republican Party can do so by themselves, I'm probably fooling myself. Inherently, sustainable social change typically requires both parties finding some level of agreement and coming to the table to work on the issue together, even if it's not the whole party. What we see in Congress right now is that when you have almost a 50-50, and we've been kind of going back and forth with this, off and on now for the past couple of decades, you've got to find some people that are willing to cross the aisle. So I think as Christians, as people of faith, what's important is that we lean into our faith perspectives, and that out of that, as individuals, if we're going to engage politics, as it were, is that we are holding both sides accountable to providing food for the hungry, caring for the widow, protecting the migrant and respecting them, and so on and so forth. Now let's shift to politics, though. So that's my pragmatic answer. That's my beat chip answer. As it relates, I think a couple thoughts. One, what we would call fundamentalists, that movement really emerged 40 plus years ago, right? It was a very well thought out strategic plan, and they invested they chose one particular political party, and they invested in a ground game. And so if you think about, let's go back to a sports reference, right? Let's go back to football first, but bear with Andy and I, and we can talk Baylor football and their rise and why they're going to win the Big 12 this year if we want to in a little bit. But you've got to, you can't just go out and try to recruit a Heisman quarterback and not have a ground game. You got to have a good offensive line. So even if you get RG3, or even if you get Cam Newton, or you get one of these amazing college football athletes, and you don't give them an offensive line that can protect them, they're going to get hammered. And they're certainly not going to win the Heisman, and you're not going to win many football games. You've got to invest in an offensive line. You got to invest in a defensive line in those positions. And fundamentalists and conservatives have invested in a ground game for 4 decades, and they've been very strategic about building that ground game, so they are not dependent upon a savior-like political figure that's going to win the day. Whereas progressives have not. Progressives have chosen to throw the Hail Mary and hope to score the touchdown repeatedly. So we have not built the same level of organizing infrastructure to support projects like addressing food insecurity or poverty or healthcare access in conservative states, you name it. We haven't done that to the degree that that conservatives have done, and certainly one-issue voters have done. And so we're seeing the fruits of that labor, or that lack of labor, right now. And who it hurts the most are people in poverty, and so we've got to transform. But that's the long game. Nobody wants to play the long game. We're a social media culture. We want to be able to grandstand, and we think that grandstanding will change policies, but grandstanding doesn't do anything. It doesn't ultimately win the day. You got to have that infrastructure, and if you do, then you'll start to see fruit from your from your labor. If that doesn't make any sense, then feel free to, we can unpack it more.
Well, no, a couple things. Number one is, Jeremy, if you ran for office, I would still vote for you. So, it's a fascinating thing because, for one, I'm going to give a compliment to the American evangelical. Smart, educated, experienced people. Expand your understanding of what pro-life means, to be inclusive to the gospel sense of pro-life, and that wouldn't it be amazing if as enough passion was going behind creating policies and putting politicians into office that are seeking to honestly end the idea of poverty and food insecurity in our country. And that was a pro-life choice. Amazing things can happen. So, I'm sorry to ask you that question. I think you're just such a sophisticated mind to be able to ponder and to answer it. But this might be a good segue for us to pause to tell you about one of our annual sponsors. Would that be okay? So McAfee's School of Theology at Mercer University, who exists to train ministers who inspire the church and the world to imagine, discover, and create God's future. Located in Atlanta, Georgia, the McAfee School of Theology offers doctoral and master degree programs, including a fully online Master of Divinity degree, the only fully online MDiv offered by a national research university. You can visit their website, theology.mercer.edu, to learn more about their programs and scholarships. Great football program, by the way, Jeremy.
It is top notch.
Yeah, another bear. Another bear.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Bears unite. So, all right. So let's talk about the book. I Was Hungry: Cultivating Common Ground to End American Crisis. The book you talk about that really there's 5 steps to create hunger-free community coalition. I want to zero into some of that. You talk about building individual trust and commitment and a community buy-in that are crucial. And you wrote that widespread collaboration is also required. Collaboration requires openness and trust. But last time I checked, and I was actually just in Washington, D.C. a couple of days ago, we still live in a highly partisan world in which we have drawn lines in the sand. And so how do we create a sense of collaboration and coalition in a time where it seems to make more sense to only support those that are in one particular party or the other?
Well, I wouldn't start in D.C., to be honest. That's a difficult place to work when you're trying to build bipartisanship right now. But you can start in your own community. And one of the reasons, we believe that you need to have a hunger-free community coalition in your community or county if you're ultimately going to create a pathway forward in hunger. We believe that because no one sector can end hunger by themselves. That inherently it requires us all working, giving our best selves towards a common purpose if we want to achieve zero hunger in our lifetime, which is certainly doable, given that we have adequate resources. We just don't do a good job of adequately resourcing everybody who is food insecure. So when you do that, though, when the Baptist sits down with the Catholic at the table and the Muslim sits down with the Jew, or when the man sits down with the woman, when the Republican sits down with the Democrat, and you're working on a local issue together, that you've identified that you want to expand access to summer meal programs for kids in your community. And that's the reason that you're at the table. Or you want to ensure that you create a community gardening effort for families that live in food deserts. Whatever issue it is that you choose to take on underneath these coalitions, it gives you an opportunity to build a relationship with somebody, in many cases, that is different than you, on an issue that you can agree about. That's the one point of uniqueness about hunger in America, is that on the local level, you typically see all people from all walks of life choosing to do something about it. So your most conservative churches in America oftentimes have food pantries. Your most conservative politicians in America have oftentimes signed on to legislation to expand access to food to either individuals in America or around the globe. this is something where you can find some bipartisan support. But when you do that, when you're sitting across the table from somebody and you begin to plan and work with them and then execute that plan to ensure access to food for families, and you see the smiles on families' faces and children's faces when they have access to that summer meal program that only exists because of the effort that you put into it with somebody that you might disagree with, you might vote differently with, you begin to build trust. And once you have trust, then you can begin to expand out from there to deal with issues where maybe it's been politically problematic for you to deal with. I use an example in the book of when I served on the Congressional Commission called the National Commission on Hunger and Poverty. It was a 10-member commission, 5 Democrats appointed, 5 Republicans appointed. If somebody had the R by their name, if you had a D by your name, you disagreed with everything that they were suggesting, and vice versa. And so we weren't getting anywhere, but we were committed to a consensus report back to Congress and then President Obama and Secretary Vilsack at USDA. And so we knew the only pathway forward for us to come up with something that was bipartisan was to get out of DC. And so we spent the next year traveling the country together, sitting in hot buses, visiting with individuals who are food insecure, meeting with individuals that were doing amazing work to address hunger in America, holding these big public hearings where anybody that wanted to have their voice heard on congressional record could have their voice heard. And where the magic happened for us was it was on those bus trips when you're hot and you're tired and you have a headache because you hadn't had as much coffee as we all require these days. And, we had I remember one individual in particular, somebody that I just butted heads with. We just naturally butted heads. But I remember we had our youngest child while I was serving on the commission, and he had his first grandkid. And here we were at the back of the bus swapping pictures of our kids. And that began to finally start to melt away some of the ego that we were bringing to the table. And we started to build a relationship. And then when we would go hear a common story from somebody that was food insecure or hear a testimony in one of these hearings, we began to be open and to hear things not just the same way, but to want to work together to address that common need in ways that we did not agree upon, even a year before that. So I think that's key, building that relationship and choosing to believe somebody when they tell you something that might even be different than what you believe to be true. It's really listening to them. But it's never going to happen if we resort to social media to try to solve our debates. It's only going to happen if we're sitting down with people and choosing to go the long road and build that relationship.
Just curious, do you want to share the name of the person on the bus, or?
Andy Hale was his name, and man, he was a guy. You got to watch out for him. That's right.
Well, everybody, secret's out now. Everybody knows that I'm at least 15 to 20 years older than you, with grandchildren running around. So
That's right. Despite how we look on camera. That's right.
Yeah. So in the book, you talk about rescuing people from a storm of poverty, and later you move towards the concept of working with, not for, the poor. How are you and the Baylor Collaborative on Hunger and Poverty currently doing this? How do those who've actually experienced poverty and food insecurity give shape to decision-making and actions within your organization?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the temptation for those of us, for people like you and me who have access to a microphone, is to think that we need to speak on behalf of somebody who doesn't. But the reality is, this idea of being a voice for the voiceless really is it can be a good thing, but most of the time it's not needed. Most of in almost every case I've ever known, with the relationships of people that I've known that I know that live in poverty, they have their own voice. They don't need me to speak for them. They need me to pass the mic and to let them have an opportunity to speak up for themselves. Those coalitions are critical. So part of what we try to do is organize the system on a local, state, federal level, or even a global level. And so those coalitions, You either have people that are experiencing food insecurity that are a part of that, or people that have experienced it as a part of that, or you have organizations that are immersed with proximity to people that are experiencing hunger and poverty, because you do want their voice to be represented in any community effort. So when I talked earlier about having, it's important to have research and proximity. Good research is not only, you're not just looking at spreadsheets. You're sitting with individuals who are experiencing hunger and poverty, and you're listening to them, and they are contributing towards your qualitative research and qualitative analysis. Your community coalitions are there listening to people in the community, so that if you determine that you need to have an effort to address food deserts in the community, you're not just coming up with a plan that's ill-informed, because you have people who are in poverty in these communities saying, this is what we want, this is what we're willing to support, this is what we're willing to work with you on, so that you don't feel like you need to do something for anyone, if that makes sense.
So, we ultimately want to point our congregations, our clergy, our lay leaders to read the book and begin conversations within their congregation, especially if they haven't considered how their church can be collaborative partners in combating food insecurities in their community. But, I wonder if we might end with thinking how they can begin to practically get involved. What are the best organizations for them to partner with? Where do they begin this kind of work within their community, especially if it doesn't exist?
You've probably heard me talk about Mary and Carol. I love to brag on them. They're at Southland Baptist Church in San Angelo, Texas, a CBF congregation there. And so the way that they got started is they kicked off, they recognized that, one, in their church, they had school board members, they had nonprofit organizations represented, they had the elected officials there, they had the business community there. And so they started by organizing their Hunger-Free Community Coalition by just talking to the people in their church. They'd also lived in their community for decades, and so they'd spent their lives cultivating trust and building relationships with people in the community. So when they said that they wanted to launch a Hunger-Free Community Coalition in Tom Green County in West Texas, people listened to them because they'd done what Stephen Covey had said that, the leadership moves at the speed of trust. Well, they had done that. And they were ready to lead. And so when they convened, people showed up. And that's the same thing that is true for our faith communities all across the CBF platform, is that our CBF churches have built long-standing relationships in their communities and are poised to begin to bring people together to say, what are we doing in our community that works well, and who's working in our community already, and what are those gaps that need to be addressed so that we can comprehensively create a plan and implement a plan to end hunger in our community. You don't have to do it alone. That's the big thing. So churches, that if there are two things that I would tell every church that I could come across, it's one, focus on faith formation. Don't bifurcate the gospel. Focus on faith formation. Lean into Matthew 25 and some of these sacred texts that really bring it together for us. And the second thing is to know you don't have to do it alone. First of all, these Hunger-Free Community Coalitions, we have a toolkit on our website at hungerandpoverty.org that communities can download. We even have a team of people that can walk you through it as a community for several years, so that you're not out there doing this, flying blind or trying to do this on your own. There are also great nonprofit organizations in most communities that have a good Meals on Wheels program, or who do have proximity to people in poverty. And so come alongside them. Don't think that you have to be an expert. Just show up. And if you identify where God's already moving in your community and you show up, good things will happen, and we can bend our world towards food and economic justice in our time.
Before we wrap up, we have to tell you about our other annual sponsor, the Center for Congregational Health, whose mission is to help faith communities and their leaders thrive. Healthy congregations can transform their communities to be more compassionate, faithful, and just. Utilizing a network of highly skilled coaches, consultants, and intentional interim ministers, the center supports congregations and ministry leaders to address the challenges they face. Visit their website, healthychurch.org, to learn more about how the center can be your trusted partner in ministry. The book is I Was Hungry. Our guest is Jeremy Everett. You can check out his work at baylor.edu/hunger and poverty. Jeremy, thank you for making the time to have this conversation. We are incredibly grateful for your good kingdom work in living out Jesus' call to love our neighbors in the way that we love ourselves.
Andy, thank you for the invitation, and thank you to CBF Churches for walking alongside our work now for over a decade. We are very grateful.
All right, that's it. That's our conversation. If you want to have more of the CBF podcast, you can check us out on all major platforms, including iTunes, Spotify, SoundCloud, Google Podcasts. Don't forget to like and share this conversation on your favorite social media platform. Be sure to support our annual sponsors by visiting their websites. Again, that's the Baptist Seminary of Kentucky, the Center for Congregational Health, and McAfee School of Theology's doctoral ministry degree. Check out our cbf.net for more information for things like church starting, field personnel, advocacy work, and much more.